Okay. Alrighty. Busy day in the actual world. All kinds of strange things happening to the American government, but we won't get to that today, as much as we would like to relate it to my little reading here. We're continuing on. I probably because I just want to get it done with. The first chapter. Whole books have been written about the first chapter of the first book of Marx's Capital, Karl Marx's Capital. And probably the reason why is because so much is front loaded into it. And at least in American English, uh, it's important to sort of sense how idiomatic or colloquial it could be. Uh, it's no different than the Revised Standard Version rather than the King James Version of the Bible, I suppose. Um, and you can make that analogy, but I'm not sure that quite goes in the same direction. But we're going to continue on here. This may take a few days, and I apologize for that. But I hope at the end people will be curious enough to. Yesterday, what I did was I took a fragment from it, the front end, and compared it to the one that's about 30 years old. And there is a difference. I think the current one does read more smoothly, and maybe it makes it a little more intelligible. On the other hand, there's still, with all due respect, much that needs to be sort of cleared away or interpreted better, whatever. And I'd like to think that people will sort of get engaged with that. I will alternate this reading with our continuing coverage of the Volume 2 series that is being done at the CSSGJ with Andrew Higginbottom, where he's up to Lecture 9, and it is, well, complicated, I suppose. On the other hand, it's actually quite useful and important to see the relationship of Volume 2, certain ideas about capital accumulation, to Rosa Luxemburg and Sismondi and Lenin. And that project of comparison is actually quite worthwhile, considering that you could even say that the current monkey business in the real world, in real life in the 21st century, has some of those issues at work. They're similar issues. And I would like to think understanding it better makes the next 4 years more, bearable, let's say. All right, so I'm down to the section on the two poles of a value expression: relative value form and equivalent form. The entire mystery of the value form. Now, let me stop here for a second and just say, there's an entire body of literature on the value form. This is the current body of interest for many Marxist scholars. And you have to sort of understand that it is a reinvestigation of a certain set of ideas that comes from finally getting most of Marx's manuscripts sort of put together in one place and publicly available, and having scholars actually tear it apart. And much of our current discourse about Marx, as well as the application to a variety of things, including, for example, eco-socialism, comes from these kinds of interpretations and the problem of what the value form, for example, might mean. It's not like it's a branding thing or a current thing, but it does open up certain degrees of interpretation that allow us to consider some contemporary movements in terms of the political economy that Marx is critiquing. The entire mystery of the value form lies hidden in this simple value form. To analyze this form is therefore a real challenge. Here, two different commodities, A and B, the linen, A, and the coat, B, play two distinctly different roles, as we can see. The linen expresses its value through the coat. The coat serves as the material for expressing the linen's value. The first commodity plays an active role. The second plays a passive one. The value of the first commodity is represented as relative value. The commodity is in the relative value form, value dash form. The second commodity acts as the equivalent. It is in the equivalent form. The relative value form and the equivalent form, A and B, are a pair, inseparable and mutually determining. But at the same time, they're mutually exclusive or positioned opposite each other. For example, they make up the two poles of the same value expression. They continually distribute themselves to the different commodities that a value expression brings into relation with each other. For example, I cannot express the value of the linen through linen. That is, 20 yards of linen equals 20 yards of linen isn't really an expression of value. It's a, it's a tautology. It's what the equation says, in fact, is the opposite. 20 yards of linen is nothing other than 20 yards of linen, a certain amount of the use value, quote unquote, of linen. The linen's value can thus be expressed only relatively through a different commodity. The linen's relative value form presupposes some other commodity opposite in the equivalent form. That other commodity, the one that acts as the equivalent, cannot also be in the relative value form. It doesn't express its own value. All it does is supply the material for another commodity's value expression. Let me just stop there for a second and say, this is one of the issues that you can have as artisanally speaking. That is, you could say, well, it's just clay or something, some material. But then once you start shaping it into something, a bowl or pot or something, you can see that there is some other set of expressions that does not necessarily negate the material itself. Now, the fact is you can't reduce everything to these material relations, because once you start interacting with it, if let's just say you're thinking in an artisanal way, the craft-like way, certain other things start to kick in. You can't disassociate it from that, even though you might try in a museum or something. So let me get back to Marx. The expression 20 yards of linen equals one coat, or 20 yards of linen is worth one coat, does imply the reverse equation, that is, one coat equals 20 yards of linen, or one coat is worth 20 yards of linen. But in order to express the coat's value relatively, I have to turn the equation around in this way, and as soon as I do that, the linen takes the coat's place as the equivalent. Thus, the same commodity can't occupy both forms simultaneously in the same value expression. Rather, these opposing forms exclude each other. Now, that's a step you need to sort of think about what that means. Whether a commodity is in the relative value form or the opposing equivalent form depends entirely on its position within each expression of value. In other words, on whether it is the commodity whose value is being expressed or the one through which value is expressed. So you see already there is a kind of the difference between communication and expression. And you can get further into that from a, sort of phenomenal point of view, but he's not really going there necessarily. So number 2, relative value form. The content of the relative value form. If we want to find out how a commodity's simple value expression lies hidden in the value relation between two commodities, we have to begin by examining this relation quite apart from its quantitative side. People have tended to proceed the other way around, seeing in a value relation only the ratio in which certain amounts of two different types of commodities count as equal, and overlooking the fact that a quantitative comparison between the magnitudes of two different things isn't possible until they've been reduced to the same unit. Only as expressions of the same unit will they have a common denominator and thus be commensurable magnitudes. Whether 20 yards of linen equals one coat or 20 coats or X coats, that is, Whether a given quantity of linen is worth a few coats or many, every such relation implies, without exception, that as magnitudes of value, linens and coats are expression of the same unit. That is, things of the same nature. Linen equals coat is the basis of that equation. But the two commodities that are equated qualitatively do not play the same role. Only the value of the linen is expressed. How so? In that the linen relates to the coat as it's the linen's equivalent or the thing it can be exchanged for. In this relation, the coat counts as value's form of existence. For example, it's a value thing, a value dash thing. Because only as such is the coat the same as the linen. The linen's own value existence, on the other hand, comes into view or attains an independent expression because only its value can the linen relate to the coat as something of equal worth, or something that it, like the linen, can be exchanged for. In the same way, butyric acid differs as a physical body from a propylformate, even though they're made up of the same chemical substances. Carbon propylformate, even though they're made up of the same substances, C carbon, H hydrogen, and oxygen O in the same proportions, namely C4H8O2. Recalling, of course, as you know, that there's a mnemonic that allows you to sort of say, well, everything is, carbon-based life forms have, one of these things, and it's the different combinations of them which determine their differences from a chemical point of view. If propylformate were equated with butyric acid, first, the propylformate would count in this relation merely as a form of existence of C4H8O2. Second, this would say that the butyric acid is also made up of C4H8O2. Equating the propylformate with the butyric acid, we express the butyric acid's chemical substance rather than its physical form. When we say as values, commodities are bare, gelatinous blobs of human labor. Our analysis reduces commodities to a value abstraction, but doesn't give them a value form different from their natural forms. Not so in the value relation of one commodity with another. What brings out a commodity's value character here is its relation with the second commodity. For example, when the coat is equated as a value thing with the linen, the labor embedded in each of them is equated. The tailoring that produces the coat is not, of course, the same concrete labor as the weaving that produces the linen. But equating it with the weaving does, in fact, reduce the tailoring to what is actually the same in both forms of labor, to their common character as human labor. This also says, in a roundabout manner, that insofar as weaving weaves value, it too is indistinguishable from tailoring. Hence, it's abstract human labor. Only an expression of equivalence between different kinds of commodities brings into view the specific character of value-generating labor. And it does that by actually reducing the different forms of labor embedded in different kinds of commodities to their common something, human labor as such. It doesn't suffice, however, to express the specific character of the labor that makes up the linen's value. Human labor power in its fluid state, in other words, human labor, creates value, but isn't itself value. It becomes value in its coagulated state, in an objective form. In order for the linen value to be expressed as a gelatinous blob of human labor, it must be expressed as something that has objecthood, as something that is different from the linen as a physical thing, but at the same time is common to both the linen and another commodity. So the problem has sort of already been solved. The coat counts as a qualitative equal in the linen's value relation as a thing of the same nature because it's a value. Here then, the coat counts as a thing through which value appears, or in other words, a thing that in its natural, touchable form represents value, particularly on a cold day. A coat, as the body of the commodity, a coat, quote unquote, is simply a use value, of course. A coat, as such, expresses value just as little as a random piece of linen does. But this only shows that the coat means something more within the linen's value relation than it does outside that relation, just as some people are more important when they're wearing a fancy embroidered coat than they are without one. When the coat is produced, actual human labor power is expended in the form of tailoring. Human labor has therefore accumulated in the coat. From such a perspective, the coat is a bearer of value, although this quality never peaks out, even when the coat is at its most threadbare. And within the linen's value relation, the coat means something only from this perspective. And thus it only counts as embodied value, as a quote-unquote value body, value-body. Despite the coat's buttoned-up appearance, the linen has recognized in a kindred, beautiful value-soul. But when the coat represents value in its interactions with the linen, value for the linen necessarily takes on the form of a coat. It's the same when the individual A starts to relate to individual B as royalty. Right away, royalty for A necessarily takes on B's physical form. That is, B's facial features, beard, and those other characteristics that change with every new lord of the realm. So with a value relation where the coat plays the role of the linen's equivalent, the coat form counts as the value form. The value of the commodity linen is expressed through the body of the commodity coat. The value of one commodity is expressed through the use value of the other. As a use value, the linen is a thing tangibly different from the coat. As value, it is something equal to the coat, and it therefore looks like a coat. In this way, the linen acquires a value form different from its natural form. That the linen exists as value becomes manifest through its being equal to the coat. Just like a Christian's sheep-like nature becomes manifest through his being equal to the Lamb of God. As we can see, in the moment that the linen begins to interact with another commodity, the coat, it tells us everything our analysis of commodity value has told us up to this point. The linen reveals its thoughts, however, in a language that it alone is familiar with. That is, the language of commodities. In order to say that labor, in its abstract capacity as human labor, creates linen value, the linen says that it and the coat are made of the same labor, insofar as the coat counts as its equal and thus is value. In order to say that its sublime value objecthood, sublime value objecthood, differs from its starched linen body, the linen says that the value looks like a coat, and so is a value thing, a value thing. The linen, is equal to the coat, just like two peas in a pod. A side note, the language of commodities has many other more or less correct dialects besides Hebrew. Less forcefully than the Romance action term valere, valoir. For instance, the German word Wertsein, to be worth, expresses that equating commodity B with commodity A is commodity A's value expression. Paris vaut bien en messe. Paris is its own whole, thing. Owing to the value relation, then, the natural form of commodity B becomes the value form of commodity A. Or in other words, B's body becomes the mirror of A's value. Commodity A relates to commodity B in such a way that B functions as a value body, value-body, as the materialization of human labor. It therefore makes the use value B into the material for its own value expression. When A's value is expressed through B's use value in this way, it has the form of relative value. Now, whether you can do this quantitatively, let me break here for a second and say, the next form, of course, we've made some qualitative connection here. The next issue is how quantitative can that, value judgment, as it were, be worth anything. B, The quantitative determination of the relative value form. Every commodity with value to express is a given amount of the useful object, 15 bushels of wheat, 100 pounds of coffee, and so on. These given amounts of commodities contain certain amounts of human labor. Hence, the value form doesn't simply express value as such, but rather quantitatively define value or magnitudes of value. And so in commodity A's value relation with commodity B, or the linen's value relationship with the coat, it doesn't simply happen that the commodity type coat acting as an unspecified value body is qualitatively equated with linen. Rather, a certain quantity of the value body or the equivalent, for example, one coat, is equated with a certain quantity of linen, for example, 20 yards. So what we see here is a kind of triangulation between linen, the coat, and this other more abstract thing, 20 yards. The equation 20 yards of linen equals one coat, or 20 yards of linen is worth one coat, presupposes that the same amount of value substance, that is value dash substance, is embedded in one coat, as in 20 yards of linen, that the two quantities of different commodities cost the same in terms of the amount of labor or labor time expended to make them. But the labor time needed to produce 20 yards of linen or one coat varies as the productive power of weaving or tailoring does. So let's now take a closer look at how such variations affect the relative expression of magnitudes of value. Number one, the linen's value varies while the coat's remains constant. If the labor time needed to make the linen doubles, say because the flax growing soil becomes less fertile, this is a Ricardo kind of thing, the linen's value will double too. Because if 20 yards of linen equals one coat, it will be 20 yards of linen equals two coats, because now one coat contains only half as much labor time as 20 yards of linen. If instead the labor time it takes to produce 20 yards of linen decreases by half because of, let's say, better looms, the linen's value will fall to half of what it had been. So now 20 yards of linen equals, well, let's say half a coat. Commodity A's relative value, that is, its value expressed through commodity B, rises and falls in exactly the same way as A's value does, as long as B value remains the same. Number two, the linen's value remains constant while the coat's varies. So, you're just switching this around. If the labor time required to make a coat doubles, let's say as a result of a bad wool season, 20 yards of linen would now equal half a coat rather than 20 yards of linen equals one coat. If the value of the coat is halved, then 20 yards of linen equals two coats. So if the value of A stays the same, its relative value expressed through B will rise and fall in inverse relation to how B's value changes. When we compare the different cases given under number one and number two, we see that contrasting causes can bring about the same change in the magnitude of relative value. The equation 20 yards of linen equals one coat thus becomes 20 yards of linen equals two coats, either when the linen's value doubles or when the coat's value is cut in half. It becomes the equation 20 yards of linen equals half a coat, either when linen's value falls by half or when the coat's value doubles. So we have two sides in which at one end, it can affect this relative relationship. And it is because of either the process is different or the resources are different. Number three, the quantities of labor needed to produce the linen and the coat could change in the same direction at the same time and in the same proportion. In such a case, 20 yards of linen would equal one coat, the same as before, regardless of how much the value changed. We would discover these variations in value the moment we compared the two commodities with a third whose value had remained constant. If the value of every commodity rose or fell at the same time and in the same proportion, their relative values would remain unchanged. The way to detect this kind of change would be to see whether, on the whole, more or fewer commodities were being produced by the same expenditure of labor time. Number four, the amounts of labor time needed to produce the linen and the coat respectively, and hence the linen's and the coat's values, the linen's value and the coat's value, might change in the same direction at the same time. But, horror, to different degrees, or these amounts could change in opposite directions and so on. Simply by applying the cases described in 1, 2, and 3, one could work out all the different combinations would affect the commodity's relative value. Actual changes in the magnitude of value are thus reflected neither unambiguously nor exhaustively in the relative expression, that is, in the magnitude of the relative value. The relative value of a commodity can vary even if its value remains constant. A commodity's relative value can remain constant even if its value varies. Finally, we should hardly expect simultaneous changes in a commodity's magnitude of value and the relative expression of that magnitude to occur in the same direction and to the same extent. Number 3, big number, section 3. Now, we've seen that when commodity A, the linen, expresses its value through the use value of a different type of commodity B, that is the coat, it impresses a special value form on B, that of the equivalent. The coat, without taking on a value form different from its bodily form, counts as equal to the linen. This is how the commodity linen brings into view that it exists at value. So, in fact, the linen expresses that it exists as value through the coat's being directly exchangeable with it. It follows that a commodity's equivalent form is the form in which it can be directly exchanged for another commodity. One type of commodity, such as coats, serves as the equivalent of another commodity, such as linen, thereby taking on the characteristic property of being in a form in which it can be directly exchanged for the linen. But this fact alone won't tell us the ratio in which coats and linen can be exchanged. Since the linen's magnitude of value is given, this ratio depends on the coat's magnitude of value. The coat's magnitude of value remains determined as before by the labor time needed to produce it, and thus not at all by its value form, regardless of whether the coat is expressed as the equivalent and the linen as relative value, or the other way around, with the linen being expressed as the equivalent and the coat as relative value. But the moment that the type of commodity coat assumes the role of the equivalent in a value expression, its magnitude of value is no longer expressed as a magnitude of value. The coat figures in the value equation rather only as a definite quantity of a given thing. Now, this can seem a little confusing, as it obviously seems. For example, 40 yards of linen is worth what? 2 coats, because the type of commodity coat is playing the role of the equivalent here, and the use value, coat, counts as the value body in its interactions with the linen. A certain quantity of coats will suffice to express a certain quantity of the linen's value. 2 coats can therefore express the magnitude of value of 40 yards of linen, but never their own magnitude of value, the 2 coats, that is, magnitude of value. Along with many of his predecessors and successors, Bailey wound up in error due to a superficial reading of the fact that the equivalent in such a value equation never has any form except that of a simple quantity of thing, of the use value. He saw a purely quantitative relation in a commodity's value expression. But the equivalent form of a commodity doesn't contain any quantitative determination of value. When we consider the equivalent form, the first peculiarity stands out is this. Use value becomes the form of appearance of its opposite, that is, value, big V value. The natural form of a commodity turns into the value form. Note, however, that this quid pro quo happens to a version of commodity B, the coat or wheat or iron and so on, only within a value relation where some other commodity, an A, that is linen, etc., has joined it. Only there, within that relation, no commodity can relate to itself as its own equivalent. Neither then can it make its natural skin into the expression of its own value. A commodity, therefore, needs to relate to another commodity in such a way that other commodities act as its equivalent. It needs to make the natural skin of another commodity into its own value form. Now, let's say that we have some pieces of iron whose weight has already been determined. Viewed on its own, the iron's physical form isn't the form of appearance of weight any more than the sugar loaf's is. Yet in order to express the sugar loaf as a weight, we put it into a weight relation with the iron. In this relation, the iron counts as a body that represents nothing but weight. Quantities of iron serve as measures of the sugar loaf's weight. And with respect to the sugar loaf's body, they express only the shape of weight, that is, weight's form of appearance. You know, the conundrum or joke expressed as, which is heavier, a ton of iron or a ton of feathers. The iron plays such a role only within this relation, where it's joined by the sugar loaf or some other physical body whose weight has to be determined, only because both things have weight. Can they enter into this kind of relation, with one serving to express the weight of the other? If we put the two things onto a scale, we would see that as weight, they're in fact the same. And so in the right proportions, they have the same weight. Functioning for the sugar loaf as is the measure of weight, the iron's physical body represents nothing but weight. Just so, the physical body of the coat represents nothing but value when it interacts with the linen in our value expression. Now, the analogy ends here. However, in the sugar loaf's weight expression, that is, the iron represents a natural property common to both bodies, their weight. But in the linen's value expression, the coat represents a supernatural property shared by the two things, their value, which is something purely social. A commodity's relative value form, say the linen's, expresses its value existence as something very different from its body and physical properties as something equal to a coat, for example. In doing so, this expression itself indicates that it conceals a social relation. It's the other way around, however, with the equivalent form. Here, a physical commodity body, such as the coat, a thing as it hangs from racks and shoulders, expresses value. The coat then gets its value form from nature. Of course, this holds only within the value relation where the commodity linen relates to the commodity coat as its equivalent, but a thing's properties don't stem from its relation with other things. Its properties are merely activated in those relations. The coat thus seems to derive its equivalent form, its property of direct exchangeability, from nature in the same way that its properties of being heavy or keeping us warm come from nature. Hence the enigma of the equivalent form, which the political economist with his crude bourgeois way of thinking fails to notice until he encounters it fully developed. That is, as money. Then in an attempt to explain away the mystical character of gold and silver, he puts less dazzling commodities in their place and recites with undying pleasure the whole list of the plain commodities that have played the role of commodity equivalent in their day. He has no idea that even the simplest value expression, such as 20 yards of linen equals one coat, holds the solution to the mystery of the equivalent form. The physical body of the particular commodity that is serving as the equivalent always counts as the embodiment of abstract human labor. And it is also always produced by a particular instance of useful concrete labor. This concrete labor thus turns into an expression of abstract human labor. If the coat counts as nothing but the realization of abstract human labor, then the tailoring actually realized in the coat counts as nothing but the form in which abstract human labor is realized. In the linen's value expression, the usefulness of tailoring doesn't lie in the fact that it makes clothes, and thus also the man, but rather in this: it produces a body that we can tell is value, a gelatinous blob of labor that can't be distinguished from the labor objectified in the linen value. In order for tailoring to make such a value mirror, nothing can be reflected in it but its abstract property of being human labor. Human labor power is expended in tailoring as it is in weaving. Both forms of labor, therefore, have general quality of being human labor. In certain cases, that quality can be the only thing that matters. When value is produced, for example, this is all very straightforward. Um, very straightforward, right? But in a commodities value expression, things become topsy-turvy. For instance, in order to express that weaving creates the linen value in its general capacity as human labor, rather than its concrete form as weaving, tailoring, that is, the concrete labor that produces the linen's equivalent, has to be set against it, weaving, as the tangible form in which the abstract human labor is realized. So a second peculiarity of the equivalent form is that concrete human labor becomes the form of appearance of its opposite, abstract human labor. Now, since the concrete labor, tailoring, counts merely as an expression of undifferentiated human labor, it has a form in which it is equal to other labor, the labor that is embedded in the linen. And so even if, like all the labor that produces commodities, it is private labor, it is nevertheless labor in a directly social form. For just this reason, it is represented in a product that is directly exchangeable for another commodity. The third peculiarity of the equivalent form is thus that private labor becomes the form of its opposite, labor in a directly social form, like producing for the market, for example. Let us turn to a great discoverer, the first person to analyze the value form and also many other intellectual, social, and natural forms. This will make it easier to understand the second and third peculiarities of the equivalent form. I am thinking of Aristotle. First of all, Aristotle clearly states that a commodity's money form is nothing more than a more developed version of the simple value form, i.e., one commodity's value expressed through some other random other quantity. 5 beds equals 1 house is no different than 5 beds, this or that equivalent of money in Greek. Therefore, further, he realizes the value relation on which this expression of value is based itself requires the house to be qualitatively equated with the bed, and that without this essential equality, these physically different things couldn't relate to each other as commensurable magnitudes. Exchange cannot occur, he says, without equality, nor can equality exist without commensurability. But then he falters and gives up on another analysis of the value form. It is then, in truth, impossible that such disparate things can be commensurable. For example, qualitatively the same. This kind of equating must be something foreign to the real nature of things involved, and therefore only a makeshift for practical purposes. So Aristotle himself tells us what stymied his analysis. Namely, he lacked the concept of value. What is this equal something? The shared substance that the house represents for the bed in the bed's value expression. Such a thing, in truth, cannot exist, says Aristotle, but yet why? Opposite the bed, the house represents something equal as long as it represents what is truly the same in both. And that is, what is it? Human labor. Aristotle, however, wasn't able to glean from the value form that in the form of commodity values, all kinds of human labor are expressed as equal human labor and hence as equally valid. With slave labor serving as its natural foundation, Greek society rested on the inequality of people and their labor power, while the mystery of the value expression, that all instances of labor are equal and equally valid and insofar as their human labor as such, could be solved only after the concept of human equality had become well established as a popular belief. No, but this can happen only in a society where the commodity form is the general form of labor products, and thus the dominant social relation is that of people interacting as commodity owners. Aristotle's genius shines precisely in his discovery of a relation of equality in a commodity's value expression. It was only the historical constraint of the society in which he lived that prevented him from finding out how. In truth, this relation of equality is constituted. So, section 4, simple value form in its entirety. Now, at this moment, I've reached the end of my discussion of this, and I know that some people perhaps are a little confused. It's easy to do in chapter one. What he's trying to do is say, we want to think about, we need to perform a kind of procedure of abstraction, and some of it seems, both epistemological and phenomenological. That is, we come in contact with something and we want to know its value or worth. Now we can estimate it because it can perform certain functions, but can it be reduced to those functions? Probably not in some cases, or in other cases at multiple functions, whatever. So what Marx is kind of working through is, well, we can actually work through the math, this kind of thing, and we can actually create a system, or at least a systematic approach to value, where we can say, how is it that we measure how something is worth? Now, the way in which you could sort of extract some concept of labor or from that does seem like an entry point. But at some moment, it turns into even more levels of abstraction, because we don't sort of know where labor fits in the process. In the case of tailoring, you have people who sew, you have people who fit, you have people who cut. I mean, you can just step right into the Adam Smith thing about that their tailoring is not just one thing, although one person could perform all those actions. Marx is reflecting on the division of labor that occurs, in society and human processes where we have this kind of division of labor. It is the kind of difference that, for the most part, in our world, is something that's very human. And I won't say uniquely human, but I would say that there is some set of divisions and set of relations that becomes more important. And it's relatively, a simple move on the one hand, in terms of human culture. On the other hand, he gets at certain other elements, what makes it equal, or what is the equality relation that exists. And hence, and with all due respect to labor history, that's kind of what we're always working on is, how is it that people can work and yet not retain a certain degree of equality? How is it that people who make clothes for the emperor don't get to be emperor? Why shouldn't they be emperor? Why couldn't they be emperor? Those kind of things. And of course, there's the emperor's new clothes problem, which is very much a Trump problem. Okay, so I'm going to stop there because I know that this may make people's heads hurt. So let me see if there are questions and comments and brickbats. No, I haven't mentioned Lenin at all. It's all Lenin.
So this gets real confusing.
I know he's trying to make it as simple on the one hand as possible and
right,
logically consistent, but so you can get real lost there.
Yeah, is he creating a bubble that has nothing to do with the market? Because didn't we talked about this before? Didn't we say that value and price are not the same thing?
Exactly.
So,
but that's at a further level of abstraction.
Okay.
He's just trying to develop a simple model relating to what his audience might be able to relate to. That is, I work in, people who work in mills have some connection to people who do tailoring. And
right. So he's kind of trying to think this through. So he's basically setting up relationships with these commodities, irrespective of how much somebody could sell it for.
Yes.
Okay.
We haven't even reached money yet. I mean, he
right.
just introduced money.
Yeah, you did mention gold and silver as a commodity, as equivalent of commodity. So yes, that kind of gets into the area of money and price.
But he hasn't even explained that yet. I mean, he's not even close to, he puts commodity forward in the first chapter, in the first section, because he wants people to be comfortable with the idea that there's a process of relationships that goes on, and that we can't always establish value instantaneously. Let's put it that way. That we sort of have to negotiate the meaning of value.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is like the simplest
Yes.
example because, I mean, coats aren't just made of linen. They have, buttons and,
Oh,
a
yeah,
liner and different things.
No, he hasn't even gotten there yet.
Oh my goodness. It's just good.
That's what makes the theory kind of, on the one hand, troubling for some folks. On the other hand, you could see that, after you've gone through reading all the pamphlets and doing the Communist Manifesto, you're out there on the barricades and you have a little bit of free time. You're sitting in a class with folks, well, why are we doing this? Well, we're doing this because of, exploitation. And we want to teach you a way in which you can talk about how different classes of people do different things, but are they, sort of fated to do those things? That's the kind of historical problem that we're working against,
Yeah.
And it's real simple in that sense. You don't have to go into heavy duty words or anything, it comes down to some very basic elements. And, he's not going real whole hog here. He's, the numbers are relatively simple. But he is trying to do something with abstract thought, and it is a critical thinking exercise. And I think that's kind of the important thing.
Right. And I guess the exercise is to try to define what value is.
Yes. How is it that we've collectively, or we've developed a way in which we can talk more generally about things that we can agree on, and we only agree on them not because we're waving arms or making noises, but rather negotiating, communicating, and that the things that we work with, things that are important to us, things that have use value or whatever, have a certain set of expressions. And of course, some of us feel real good when we've managed to get something for which, the price, I had to get a book for a course I was taking in ecology. And for some reason, when I hunted online for it, it was priced at, I don't know, a tenth of what the price was even used. And so immediately I jumped right on it and got it, and was very proud of myself for getting a $50 book for $5. And I was just, the book hasn't changed. It was the same book that was being used in the class. It was, actually in good condition. But for some reason, for X number of reasons, the company that was selling this, the bookseller, decided that, well, we just need to move these things. And hence, I got a deal. On the other hand, my book, go ahead.
I was going to say it's not just the paper, it's the ideas in it too. There's a real interesting commodity relationship somewhere in there, huh?
Absolutely. And that's what we're stuck with in these days, right? Programming, for example, code.
I'm curious, who is he writing for here? And what was the dominant or prevailing understanding by the capitalist class regarding labor? They were well aware of the exploitation going on.
Yes.
But to what degree did they understand?
Well, I mean, you can see that at this particular moment in time, you have revolutions going on and crises occurring in the capitalist system across Europe. Kings are being toppled, etc. And you kind of worry, who's going to be in charge, or why are things so screwed up? Prices at all. And so people are organizing themselves. Some people are organizing themselves around suffrage. That is, whether men should have a vote at all. The Chartists, and they're more worried about that. But the fact that they think they should have a vote some kind of vote or, some kind of stake in the government is a, problematic thing. Yet it sort of fits into a whole body of other things that have been working, since the 12th, 13th century. And, it's anomalous for the British, right? The British ruling class, all the people with titles at all and own most of the land, and they still do, which is really also terrible. Well, what are you going to do? All these poor people are going to come and kill us. You have to sort of work through how to get people to be okay with whatever their lot in life is. And so you need kind of a theory to give people a set of analysis so that, okay, this is what we're organizing for. We're organizing for some very simple things. Some sort of equality in wage that will allow us to, sustain ourselves. And we need to work on what counts as being, it's fair, right? And fairness is, a really stupidly variable qualitative thing, but you sort of need to organize around something. And fairness seems to be at least okay. Now, there are other theories, of course. I mean, there are other theories that would say, well, screw that shit. We know what they own. We should just take it from them, So that was going on at the same time, too. So you've got all these things going on, and, the army, unfortunately, happens to be on one side rather than the other. And identifying, creating collective solidarity with a group is really important, and you manufacture them in certain ways. Lane has mentioned union banners, because that's a kind of important, because it does represent a really fine quality of labor, and women's labor, if nothing else. There's a whole other thing that's going on there relative to the conduct of your family, et cetera, even if you have kids out there in the mines, et cetera. So it is, there are cultural elements that tie these things together. So, union bands, that is ones that are not electronic, they're brass instruments or whatever, are part of the kind of expression of solidarity of a particular class of workers. And it represents all of them in all of their particular ways, but it also, in their public expression, that is, if you have a miners' band or organization or union, whatever, you express that. You have a march. You go do stuff like that. You can do it because you're celebrating, but you can also do it because you have solidarity, because you're on strike and you need to sort of express that solidarity in a variety of ways. That may not explain the role of this, who this is addressed to. At this particular moment, I think that Marx and Engels see themselves as making something that has not only importance, in sort of doing this basic work of explanation, but also something that might endure through time. So there's an ego at work there. Marx presumes in his little brain that he can write something that is as critique, as important as those who actually have a little bit more power, people like Ricardo or Smith, who actually have a little bit more position, as it were. See, Marx never has that kind of position. He's a German emigre. He's sort of a refugee. He's on the run. And he's, of course, a German in a British, in a country where he speaks, British English probably better than most people, but it's clear that he is, a German. I don't know if that really truly reflects a good answer for it, but I think Marx saw his place in history not simply as someone writing a textbook or creating a tool necessarily, but he actually believed, and I think that it's an important task, he was, creating a kind of theory for things that was better than the pre-existing theories. Now, of course, there are plenty of other theories that are going on at the same time, and that's why we do make all these comparisons to Sismondi and Bailey and blah, 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 blah. Marx, because of his dedication, because other people, conferred a kind of value on him, and because he positioned himself within a variety of working activity and classes and organizations, and socialist groups and revolutionary activity. You know, he had a certain place in there, and that's kind of important. Marx never gets, well, I don't, oh, I think he's probably been jailed, but he never, I think, spends time in prison. And I don't recall anyway. Maybe he did. But he wasn't quite as, you know, opprobrious as some other folks. You know, Luxembourg, for example, spent several years in prison. Marx doesn't quite do that. He's not out on the barricades, you know.
You have the carbuncles to deal with.
Oh, and those carbuncles. Bastard. I hope that addressed that question more. It is classist in that sense. That is, you know, it is trying to indulge a kind of high theory. But speaking as someone who likes doing that, I think it's worthy mental activity. Certainly keeps, you know, it allows me not to lose my mind. That is, to have memory problems kick in, which I would assert not runs in my family, but it's fairly clear that dementia occurs at much later ages in my family. I'm not there yet.
I was under the impression it was on a loop there for a minute.
Oh, it did seem like on a loop, but he is talking about equivalence. You know, he's talking about, well, there's these equalities, and we move from one type of equality, a concrete equality, to a abstract equality, and that they're not separate. They rather are always related. My example that I would use if I were teaching again would be that certain materials begin to change the nature of that relationship between concrete things and abstract things. One material that does that is modern plastic, a petrochemical, you know, thing. Because plastic allows us to make some things into wholly other things that we don't quite see the connection to sometimes.
Well, yeah, that's, you know, it'll take a while, I think. But to me, I want to say that human labor is sort of like this common denominator.
Yes.
For these commodity relations. But then that's got to be incomplete, because not everything that has value is derived through human labor, right? Necessarily, or is it?
Well, that's always the question. You know, at what point in the process, that is,
I guess you have to dig gold up, right?
Well, exactly. No. Extraction technology is actually pretty heavy duty, right?
Yeah.
It takes a while to dig up gold.
Got to sift through tons of other stuff too to get it.
Oh, I mean, if you're watching the History Channel in the United States, you know, there's those idiotic gold, you know, miner programs. You know, at the end, they come up with, you know, really a very small amount of gold, but it's worth still a lot of money. But you've got, you know, tons of heavy equipment and, you know, lots of wastewater and all kinds of crap
the
going
mountain's
on.
gone. Yeah.
That's right. Or you're dredging, you know, there's a whole dredging thing that those people do. No, the businesses in all these abstract things. I mean, the difference between non-fair trade coffee and regular coffee is what?
Well, assuming they're engaging in fair trade.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's a different thing, you know, whether the package is truthful.
Yeah. So that. Go ahead.
No. Just ask yourself the question of what counts as fair trade coffee. And if you go to your local, you know, Pete's or Starbucks, you know, should you be making those kinds of choices, and do you pay for that difference in your consumption?
I think so, yeah.
Well, I think you do. I mean, in the sense that if you want my business, I only drink fair trade coffee. Now, I don't drink fair trade coffee because it's really actually very hard to find fair trade coffee, with all due respect, in my local supermarket. In fact, I would say that my supermarket has no fair trade coffee. And I tend to buy according to price as well. I buy cheap shit coffee. Though fortunately it's ground for poor people, so because it's so finely ground, it actually is much stronger, and I much prefer it that way, and I don't care whether it tastes like shit or not.
Would you like is it Turkish coffee where they like leave the grounds in?
Well, that would be the most extreme version of it. Thank God I don't do that. But
Turkish coffee is the finest grind.
yes,
Espresso is the next one up.
yes. It's easier to handle. Because when
And
it's
whether you
mud-filled.
leave the coffee grounds in or not could be Turkish, could be cowboy, could be
Indeed.
depending on your
Indeed.
filter.
Indeed. And in fact, for me, it's like a little effort to sort of I go into my supermarket and I compare prices of coffee, and, there are very few supermarkets here. They still allow grinds at Trader Joe's, but, most supermarkets now don't allow you to grind your coffee. So it's something you have to do for yourself. I mean, that's at the bean to freshness level. That's just one type of consumption. But the other type of consumption is, I buy cheap brick, brick type coffee that comes down to somewhere between $3 and $4 a pound. And I'm always amazed when I go into my little supermarket and go, well, look at the cost per pound of this shit, $20, $15 a pound. I go, I mean, I want caffeine, but I don't want it that much. I can't afford it.
Have you tried there's this one that they advertised on MR that I got some a long time ago. I think it was justcoffee.coop, something like that.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of it. But
It was delivered. I was like, whoa.
Oh. Whoa.
Now I'm curious. I want to go check out the source and the price,
Well, there are all of these kinds of things. When Dave from Pennsylvania described the way that he makes coffee, it was just like I'm going, whoa, that's complicated, but it's fairly cheap, and I guess he makes coffee that he likes or whatever. I just wouldn't go through all those, steps, I guess. I much prefer highly ground, cheap coffee.
You're not one of those snooty pour over types?
Well, I have several
Your
different
timers
types.
and
No. I have several different types of
thermometers.
No, I bought a $6 espresso machine yesterday at the thrift store, partially because it was $6. It was a Braun. I've just started using it, and pretty much delivers the same product. And it's fine. It's a little cheaper and sleazier than my Krups, the Krups that I bought for $8. And whatever. I'm going to use the $5 one or $6 one more now, just because I'm just economically I can use it up, and it still delivers a cup of coffee.
Nice.
It's not as good as the $8 one. I actually prefer the $8 one, but now that I bought a $5 one that does pretty much the same job with the same equipment, and I sort of customized it by using a different basket, whatever, I can get 13 bar whatever pressure out of this really cheap thing. No one cares
Barista.
about this. I know. No one cares about this, but I compare my little work here with those folks who, have $1,000, espresso machine things, which are really good. And if I'm out interacting with people or whatever, I always, try to get espresso because my taste hasn't completely gone, but it's about the drugs for me. So whatever.
What do you pay for coffee per pound?
You mean when I'm out?
No, per pound, when, when you buy ground coffee.
Oh, well, I try and get it below $3.
Holy Christmas. That's cheap coffee.
I can get coffee at $3 a pound. I do. I buy it regularly at $3 a pound. You have to sort of hunt around a little bit. So I'm in Ocean State in my, they have
Oh, Ocean State. Yeah.
Ocean State will crank up either local or imported cheap coffee with a reasonable espresso ground, and and sometimes it's ground okay, or other the worst case is for me is to regrind coffee, which I don't really like doing, but sometimes you have to do it. But for the most part, as I say, I can get these little 8-ounce or 10-ounce bricks of coffee that range from anywhere from, well, they used to be $2. Now they're $3 or somewhere between $2 and $3. So
Outrageous.
technically it's $4 to $5 a pound, I guess. But I'm not thinking about that all the time. I'm thinking according to price and size, and fortunately the ones that are designed for Latinx cultures are better, they're ground more finely. So I get my espresso like thing. And yes, I know what good crema is and blah blah blah. And I try and get my little machines to do that, my cheap machines to do that. And for the most part, I can. I mean, the new $5 one, $5 machine I have doesn't quite do a crema. And I'm still working with that, trying to get it to do that.
I
my
get
$8 cups does have good crema. It has crema almost as good as going to Starbucks or whatever.
really. So why did you buy the new one then, if that was working fine?
It was $5 man.
Yes, but you could have put that $5 in a mutual fund, and and next
Damn,
and
sure,
when your
let's put
crops
on YouTube.
break,
This is hoarding. This is hoarding.
Yeah.
I don't know whether I'm going to add a decent espresso machine in the future, and I only buy new espresso machines maybe once a year. So, whatever.
once a year. So what is this thing composed of for $8? What is
You're like I used to be with bread machines.
Yes.
Go to the local flea market every year to get a new one.
Because people don't like using bread machines, or it's a gift, and people don't have enough time or energy or whatever.
By the time mine wore out, the coating on it from overuse, go to the flea market the next year, and someone else's brand new wedding gift would be there waiting for next to nothing. It's
Yep.
super practical.
Usually that's the cheap espresso machines are like that. And if you go to the thrift store, you either have Keurig type or actual Keurig K-cup machines, or, a bunch of cheap espresso makers. Now, they're in all kinds of shape. You got to be discerning and blah, blah, blah. The $5 one, I think, has probably had a fair amount of use, but the $8 one I have, which the reason why I'm hoarding it is because it's in pretty good condition for a Model 1 Omega Krups machine. So,
Do we have a
so it was
measure?
used. I didn't realize it was used. I was wondering what
I
kind
don't
of
care.
machine you're getting if it.
Oh, no. Yeah, I get used machines. I don't care, where my coffee has been. It produces at such a high temperature that any cooties are, usually.
Oh yeah, no, that's not a problem.
And they're usually in good shape because, as Joe was saying, they're wedding gifts or something, and people, just don't, want their coffee like that for whatever reason.
It
But they
makes me
don't-
think of.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. You buy your coffee at Ocean State. I thought you said you got your espresso machine there too.
Oh, no.
Okay. Now it's starting
Reminds-
to make sense.
No. I go to Goodwill and places like that for my espresso machines.
Okay.
It reminds me of like fitness memberships, after
Oh,
the new
God.
year, but you don't have to actually have the machine. It's like you can there's all these unused memberships that it's a good gig to be in the fitness place,
Oh
I guess.
God, it is such a racket. When I lived in Chicago, I had that exact problem. I mean, I wasn't of sufficient status to have to be a member of a club or anything, but I wanted to play squash. And so the only fucking place with public or publicly accessible squash courts was snooty Upper North Side fitness clubs. And then I think I joined for a little while, but it was too fucking expensive. God. Well,
Do
I
we
was.
have? Is there an economic measure for like how much used stuff? It would seem like that's a good sort of
Oh yeah.
way to see how humans are over consuming is how much stuff they're buying and then just getting rid of, or selling again.
Oh, I'm sure there is. The current thing I'm staring at that makes either little or no sense to me. Still, I'm trying to figure out whether there's a way of trying to working through the rent problem. Is the difference between wet and dry aircraft leasing. I know that doesn't make any sense to anyone, but it is actually the current state of airline operation is that most people do kind of dry leasing, but there's a new form that is now becoming more dominant, let's say, is the leasing business about airlines used to be that leasing company that the airline would not own its own airplanes. They would lease the airplanes and they would lease them for a certain amount of time. So if you paint them up in your own colors, you don't have to deal with it for a while, and you're not paying all the front end costs. There's now a situation where there are companies that do full service wet leasing where they provide pilots and crews and food service and shit like that so you would lease a wet company in order to fill in the demand on your routes. So like during holiday times when you need to add on more flights, rather than try to finagle your existing fleet, you have these wet leasing arrangements. I'm sorry to describe all this stuff in detail, but that's kind of things I'm trying to figure out because it is a form of rent anyway.
Yeah, and a measure of, I guess, it's like, I don't know. I wanted to say waste, but maybe that's not quite right.
It's actually more efficient in some ways, but it's only, I mean, and profitable, but it is, it presumes all kinds of other stupid things. So whatever.
I
There's
watched
all
it.
kind. I just
I
don't
watched the thing.
understand the
Oh,
industry so well. Carry on. Sorry.
I watched a thing about free ports today, and there's one in Italy somewhere where this extremely very very posh Vinier um they use the free port because by law the free port has to keep things at a certain temperature,
Yes.
and they couldn't always guarantee that in their factory, so they think it's cheaper. So there's this free port with extremely expensive wine just sitting there.
Oh, there's all kinds of
It-
shit in
and
reports.
it's so expensive. It's got its own uh, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Like a fire hydrant system in case it goes and sets on fire. It's got its
Yeah.
own room. It's got its own.
Fire suppression, like,
Yeah, that's fire suppression system.
Yeah.
It's got, but it has to be because it has to be kept at a perfect temperature. But it's like millions and millions of pounds worth of
Oh yeah. Welcome to
expensive
capitalism.
wine just sat there.
Well, but art galleries do this. This is there's a whole thing, and with respect, I would assume that if these were properly regulated, whatever, we would get a better sense of money laundering and all those other things going on.
yeah.
I apologize for that little digression on wet and dry leasing, whatever.
Oh, that's cool.
It has other metaphorical capabilities, but I just said that its very basis. I find it interesting. That's all. It's a further development of what used to be dry leasing. That is, because a significant number of airlines, bigger airlines, I think, have that relationship with the ownership, the property ownership of their equipment.
Looking for efficiency. Huh?
Well, that's kind of it's kind of how they got so much use out of those 737s. So 737 is just an amazing little economic thing. It's like a DC-3.
A kind of multi-purpose, like.
Yeah, it could do all kinds of shit. And it's good for certain size airlines. It just, it has good capacity. You can stretch them out a little bit. You can put better engines on them, and they kind of are fairly efficient. And before they fucked up with that Max 737 shit, it's on, they're making a lot of money. Oh, God damn it. Oh, I didn't shut, let's shut off the live stream. I'm sorry. Oh, God, son of a bitch. Whatever. I was.
Family show.
Oh,
So
man.
many F-bombs.
Jesus Christ. I'm sorry. God damn it. Shut it off.
The A320 is chomping at the 737's tail always.
Yes.
The Airbus A320. Chop, 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 chop.
The article I was reading was, a wet leasing company has a full line, not just of, the lower 319, 320 Airbuses, but the whole range of 380, whatever